Welcome back. Glad to have you. Well, how'd you do on the test? I've had mixed reviews, but sound like overall was a success. I think many of you did very well, and that's great. We'll have some more of those in the future and with some changes and possibly some shorter ones, but that was our first test, and I'm looking forward to completing some more sections of the good book. So we're looking at the story. We're going to do a quick review of the first period, which is the period of the self-rule, as we prepare to move into the second chapter of the great story, the period of the Father's rule. But for now, we're just going to kind of get caught up to date. Glad you could join us, and we're looking forward to participating together in this another adventure into the good book. All right, so we got the story. It's a mystery. We've established that. Ephesians chapter 3 indicates that the story is a mystery, and what we're interested in is that the mystery gets revealed as we read the book to see what God's overall intentions are along the way. So, in the story, we're looking at the foreword of that book. That is, give me a quick rundown of what this book is about. I saw the great white throne and him who sat upon it. From his presence, earth and sky had fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. And they were judged according to the books. Things were written in the books. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. So our story will end with this scene. And that's one of the reasons we've got involved. We want to know if we're going to pass the judgment. And those books are the Bible, and that's why we're reading that. And we certainly have a certain amount of respect and fear of that day. But really, at some point, what we need to do is be motivated to this part of the picture. This is John's account in Revelation 21. I saw the new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eye, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. That is the game, the end game. That is what we're after. The glorious moment in which all of God's plan will be accomplished. And so we recognize the 4 P's in God's plan, and we recognize that there is an eternal purpose, and that centers around the person of Jesus the Christ, who carries out the plan of God. And then, if followed, that is the plan, a certain product is produced. And we have been focusing on that as our basic outline for examining the story. So, we have the story. It's a mystery. We're trying to get to pass the judgment so we can enjoy being in the presence of God and no pain or sorrow. So we examine the table of contents of this book, and we see that there are 7 distinct chapters, each chapter connected by the overall idea of authority, the question of authority. So in the chapter 1 that we just finished, all the way through chapter 7, that will lead us to that picture we just looked at. And that is the idea that in the end, the kingdom of God will be fully and completely in place. As the scripture said from Daniel, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that's what we're working towards. We want to be citizens of that kingdom. So we want to be able to pass the judgment. We can't pass the judgment if we don't know the terms of the judge. So we're reading this story, and we've just completed our first chapter. That is the period of self-rule. Now let's see if you can get along with me and recite the major factors and events. First of all, the self-rule period is the period from Adam to Nimrod. It is covered in Genesis chapters 1 through 10. Some of the major characteristics are that the instructions about what man was to do are oral in nature, oral instructions given direct from God, and we've seen that throughout the first 10 chapters. Those instructions were passed on from father to son, and then authority rests with the individual. The individual person is responsible for carrying out the moral code, the conduct, as received from Adam in his eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Also, we've looked at the initiation of the concept of sacrifice. So let's recount the particular events in order, if you would like to follow along with me. Obviously, event number 1, 4000 BC, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Number 2, well, that didn't last. And they got kicked out of the garden, and we know that story, how that all happened and where the serpent was involved in that event. The next major event recorded in the text comes in chapter 4, and that is the story of Cain and Abel. And we've covered that thoroughly, and we know the major points there being first murder, also the fundamental principle as God spoke to Cain when his sacrifice was rejected. He was angry, and God asked him, why was he angry? Because if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, but you must master it. So we got some details in that account. Now, time went along, and man, it looks like during this period of time, as Cain was cast out from the presence of God, that he went and began to develop cities. And the farther away that man got from God, he began to replace God with his own images. And so it's during this period of time that idols began to be a part of the human family's existence. However, there is one bright spot during this period. His name was Enoch. He was a man that was accepted or pleasing to God, as the text says, and he didn't die. God took him. He never experienced death, and God took him because he was pleasing to God. So while Enoch was preaching about the goodness of God, and we have that record from I think it is the book of Jude, that he did some preaching, but man was forever going farther and farther away from God and worshiping idols and all kinds of things. And that, of course, happened at about 1,000 years after the creation, at about 3000 BC, this event. So man's been on the planet for about 1,000 years, several generations, and he is already forgotten, in a sense, the Creator God. That caused the reality of the flood. And so at about 1600 BC, God flooded the earth and purged it from all of the sin except for Noah and his family, the 8 persons in that family. And so we looked through that account for several major factors, the initiation of capital punishment, the promise of the rainbow. All of those were elements of this most terrible event. Landing on the mountains of Ararat. Now, man moves out across the face of the earth, and he begins to start all over. However, it doesn't take him long, and he's back to his old tricks, and he's building a city and a tower in honor of himself. and he's forgotten all about God, or he's just blended him into his own system. That takes place about 2000 BC. So the first 10 chapters of Genesis take in a large amount of history of the human family, and we get the major points as we've seen them here, and that's contained within the self-rule period. So that was chapter 1, and we're prepared to go into chapter number 2. And so we have the story picking up in chapter 11, but we want to take just a brief moment to notice something here. This is the story of Job. And you say, what's Job? Job is way down in the Bible. What am I bringing this? Well, remember that the Old Testament is not in chronological order. It doesn't follow the chronological path. And so in the rearranging of the books, we can be pretty confident that the story of Job is an old story. And I've asked my cousin from up in the hills to come and give the introduction. He's been bugging me to get into this video, so I'm going to let him into the video, and he's going to give the introduction to the book of Job. And he's a pretty smart fellow, but, some of the kinfolk, sometimes they just don't come out in public too much, but I'm going to let him introduce the book of Job. But I want you to pay close attention to the introduction as we're going to cover this book first before we continue on into the book of Genesis. And my cousin, he's going to explain it to you why that's the case. So follow closely as my cousin comes in here. And there he is. Oh, there he is. Yeah, well, good to see you, cousin. Now take it away. It's all on you.
Well, howdy there. Thanks a lot there, cousin, for letting me in on this here video. I love talking about the Bible. And you give me this chance to introduce the book of Job, one of my favorite books. Yeah, it might look like in the background I'm kind of in a bomb shelter, but that's really just my basement. I got my canned goods back there getting ready for the spring season. In case there's hard times, we got some food here. But he said I could introduce. He really let me in because I'm the smart one in the family, but he let me introduce the book of Job. So neither the book of Job nor any other book of the Bible indicates forthrightly when God's servant Job lived upon the earth. Furthermore, no biblical genealogies with chronological information that are found in Genesis 5 and 11 help in approximating the century in which Job lived. In other words, we really don't know for sure when Job lived. We got some clues and some things that we might be able to put together like a puzzle, but we don't know exactly because no other book says so. But let's take a look at some of the clues that we do have. Nevertheless, various clues within the book of Job seem to indicate that Job lived sometime after the flood, but before the time of Moses. So we got something like the Tower of Babel, all the way up to Abraham, Isaac, or even possibly Jacob. The details this from are found within the book of Job itself. And here are some examples of those clues. Post-diluvium status seems apparent from a question. Wait a minute, post-diluvium. I bet you don't think hillbillies know what that means. Do you know what it means? Post-diluvium. That means a deluge, like a flood. So it's after the flood. There's a question in the passage of Job Eliphaz raises in his final speech. While accusing Job of wickedness, Eliphaz asks, "Will you keep to the old ways which wicked men have trod, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a," you got it, flood? That's in Job 22:16. Now, our second clue, Job was a patriarch who lived prior to the time of Moses and probably closer to the time of Abraham. And this seems evident from the following facts. Like other patriarchs of old, Job, as head of his family, offered sacrifice to God, Job 1 and Job 42. In the book of Job, there is no mention of the Levitical priesthood, the tabernacle, the temple, or even the law of Moses. Unlike Israelite law, where the family's inheritance was passed on to daughters only in the absence of sons, Job gave his daughters an inheritance among their brothers. Job's material wealth was measured not in money, but in the amount of livestock owned, which is more characteristic of the patriarchal times. So you probably noted with me that through these kinds of clues, it seems to fit the time frame, probably right around the time of Abraham. Item. Job lived long before the time of Moses, and this seems evident by the fact of the longevity of his life. You know, I got a hillbilly cousin lived to be 110. We thought that was old. But the longevity of Job's life, he lived like one of the patriarchs up around 2200 BC. The book of Job reveals that Job lived long enough to marry, become the greatest of all the men in the East, and then witness his first 10 children and watch them reach at least the age of accountability, and probably much greater ages. Then, after suffering great loss of all of his children and all his material wealth, God blessed Job with 10 more children and twice as much wealth. The book of Job then concludes. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. Well, I don't have any kinfolk that have been able to live that long. Thus it would appear that Job lived well into his 200s or beyond. Interestingly, the Septuagint test, you don't think a hillbilly knows what Septuagint is. We do too. Clem's got one. Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Well, that Septuagint testifies that Job died at the age of 240 years, an age more comparable to the ancestors of Abraham. So there you got it. Bunch of clues telling us about where Job should fit into the story that my cousin, the professor, who's going to tell you more about that later on, there's some evidence that he's putting it in the right place. Here is a longevity chart, and we're going to stick Job right in there sometime after the flood and in the days of Shem and Eber and Peleg and all them guys, possibly all the way up to the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we've already discussed. So this book is going to go in there. So we're going to go, as we've done, the professor has got you through Genesis chapter 10. And before we jump into 11, we're going to insert the book of Job right. The book of Job is pure Arab poetry of the highest and most, oh boy, there's a word that I don't know what it is. You better look that one up, folks, because that's not a word we use up here in the hills. So I think that what it means is it's a pretty fine book. It's Arab poetry. That's why when you read it in English, it's not going to sound just as sweet as it does because it was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew, and the rhyming scheme and all that kind of stuff of the poetry type is not going to make sense because the words have different sounds. But the scholars tell us it is a fine piece of literature. Look here what old Franz said. He said that he regarded the book as primarily a didactic poem. The book of Job is an astonishing mixture of almost every kind of literature to be found in the Old Testament. Many individual pieces and paragraphs can be identified as proverbs, riddles, hymns, laments, curses, and lyrical poetry. Well, I'd say that's a mighty fine list of stuff. I wish I could read Aramaic. No, none of my kinfolk can read it, but I'll bet you it's a sweet deal. Nonetheless, it still tells a wonderful story. And there's also one more unique characteristic about the book of Job. Job has more words of unique occurrence and a richer vocabulary than any other biblical book. Woo, that's saying a lot. That's saying a lot. So we've got our introduction to the book of Job, and it's going to be a rich book. So we for next time. And the professor's going to take you the rest of the way. He might let me back in sometime, but he said all them classmates are getting ready to get to back. Irene, she's coming back, and William's coming back, and all them guys. They're going to be back next week. Yep, they're done with their little winter break, and they're going to come back for class. So he just let me introduce this book, and that's what I've done. And I hope to see you maybe in the future. But for now, you just go on and read that book of Job, and see you next time. The professor will. And remember, may God bless you. And would you please just pass that blessing on to someone else. You have a great day now.
This has been a Badger Godbolt production. For more information or to ask a question, please feel free to contact us at crack.open.the.book@gmail.com. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Crack Open the Book, at youtube.com. And don't forget to follow us so you never miss an opportunity to have a conversation about truth.